I want to start by slowing the story down because the headline version moves too fast and tells you almost nothing about what actually matters. You have probably seen the clips, the thumbnails, the breathless claims that Donald Trump money is suddenly inaccessible, that banks are panicking, that Mar-a-Lago itself is somehow in play. And your instinct might be to either cheer, scoff, or dismiss the whole thing as internet noise. But if you do that, you miss the deeper economic reality hiding underneath. And that reality has very little to do with one man and a lot to do with how power, debt, and liquidity actually work in modern capitalism. What is being discussed right now, and I want to be careful and responsible here, is not a confirmed overnight seizure of assets, but a convergence of legal pressure, financial risk assessment, and institutional self-protection. When people say accounts are frozen, what they often mean is that access to credit tightens, transactions get delayed, collateral gets reevaluated, and banks quietly put distance between themselves and a client they now view as radioactive. That does not happen with a press release. It happens in back offices, compliance departments, and risk committees where nobody is interested in politics and everybody is interested in not being the last one holding the bag. Here is the part most coverage skips. Wealth at the level we are talking about is not a pile of cash sitting in a vault. It is leverage. It is loans backed by properties, properties backed by valuations, valuations backed by confidence, and confidence backed by the assumption that the system will keep treating you as safe. Once that assumption cracks even a little, everything downstream starts to wobble. And if you have ever had a credit line cut, a mortgage denied, or a bank suddenly ask more questions than it used to, you already understand this dynamic in your bones. The reason legal judgments matter so much in this context is not just the dollar amounts themselves. It is what they signal. They tell lenders that future cash flows are uncertain, that assets might be encumbered, that reputational risk has turned into balance sheet risk. Banks do not wait for the final shoe to drop. They move early, quietly, and defensively. That is not ideology. That is how finance survives. Now think about liquidity, because this is where the story gets real. Liquidity is the ability to turn what you own into what you can actually use. You can own buildings worth hundreds of millions on paper and still struggle to pay immediate bills if the system around you decides to slow the conversion process. Legal fees, staff salaries, operational costs, even mundane expenses all require cash flow, not prestige. When access tightens, power shrinks very quickly, regardless of what the headline net worth says. And I want you to notice something important here. This is not a special rule invented for one high-profile figure. This is the same machinery that grinds down small business owners when a bank pulls a line of credit, that crushes families when refinancing disappears, that forces layoffs when lenders get nervous. The only difference is scale and visibility. The system behaves the same way every time. So before we jump to conclusions about collapse or vindication, we need to understand what this moment actually represents. It is a case study in how fragile elite power becomes once institutional trust erodes, and how quickly capitalism stops being forgiving when you are no longer useful, predictable, or safe. And that lesson, whether you admire or despise the person at the center of it, is one that affects you far more directly than most people want to admit. To understand how we got here, you have to step back and look at the long runway that led to this moment. This did not begin with a single court decision or a sudden mood swing inside a bank. It began years ago with a business model built less on producing value and more on constantly refinancing reputation. The Trump Organization, like many real estate empires, functioned by rolling debt forward, revaluing assets upward, and using tomorrow optimism to pay for today obligations. That strategy works remarkably well in a system that rewards confidence more than cash and branding more than balance sheets, which is why it has been replicated across corporate America for decades. But leverage cuts both ways. When times are good, it amplifies power. When scrutiny increases, it magnifies risk. Once prosecutors, regulators, and courts begin asking whether valuations were inflated or disclosures were misleading, the question for banks is no longer about loyalty or politics. It becomes about exposure. If an asset might be subject to liens, penalties, or forced sales, It becomes a weaker form of collateral overnight. And when collateral weakens, credit tightens. That is not drama. That is accounting. You might be wondering why this seems to be accelerating now. The answer is that financial institutions move in herds, especially when uncertainty spikes. No bank wants to be the one that extended favorable terms right before conditions changed, so they review accounts, reassess risk classifications, and quietly downgrade relationships. Sometimes that shows up as delayed transactions. Sometimes that shows up as requests for additional guarantees. Sometimes that shows up as the inability to move money the way you used to. From the outside, it looks sudden. From inside the system, it is methodical. There is also a political economy angle here that rarely gets discussed. When someone loses institutional protection, they do not just lose legal cover, they lose informal privileges. Phone calls do not get returned as fast. Exceptions disappear. Rules that were once flexible suddenly become rigid. You have probably experienced a version of this yourself at work or with a landlord or a lender. The moment your perceived status drops, the system reveals its true shape. Now let us talk about Mar-a-Lago, because symbols matter. A property like that is not just real estate, it is a keystone asset, something used to signal solvency and strength to lenders and partners. When federal or state authorities evaluate an asset, even preliminarily, it introduces friction. Friction slows deals, slowness costs money, and money in this context is oxygen. Without it, operations suffocate regardless of how famous the owner is. It is tempting to frame this as a morality play, as punishment or justice or revenge, but that framing misses the structural lesson. Capitalism does not care about narratives. It cares about enforceability, predictability, and recoverability. Once those are questioned, the system protects itself, not the individual. And that is why this story matters to you, even if you never owned a skyscraper or flew on a private jet. Because the same machinery that can isolate a billionaire when risk spikes is the machinery that disciplines workers, renters, and small borrowers every day. It is the same logic that says your debt is your responsibility. But the system failures are nobody's fault. Watching it play out at the top does not make it fair. It just makes it visible. Now, I want to walk you through how this actually works on the inside, because the mechanics are where the power really lives. When a bank looks at a client like this, it is not staring at headlines or cable news segments. It is looking at risk models, covenant triggers, and worst-case scenarios. Every major loan agreement contains clauses that allow lenders to act if certain conditions change. Not just missed payments, but legal exposure, regulatory action, or material uncertainty. These are the fine print levers that almost nobody reads, but they shape outcomes long before a crisis becomes public. Think of it like this. You did not lose your job yet, but your employer announces layoffs are coming. Your landlord hears about it. Suddenly, they want extra documentation. Your credit card company quietly lowers your limit. Nothing dramatic happened, but your economic reality shifted. At the elite level, the same logic applies, just with more zeros and better lawyers. The system anticipates instability and moves to insulate itself from losses. Legal judgments play a central role here because they transform abstract risk into concrete obligation. Once courts impose penalties or damages, that obligation competes with lenders for priority. Banks hate competition. They want to know they are first in line if something goes wrong. If they are not sure, they pull back. That is when liquidity problems start to show up, not because the money vanished, but because permission to use it was quietly revoked. And here is the uncomfortable truth. In modern finance, access is more important than ownership. You can own assets and still be functionally constrained if the institutions that mediate money decide you are no longer worth accommodating. This is what people mean when they say power is relational. It exists only as long as others agree to honor it. Once that agreement weakens, even immense wealth becomes awkward, slow, and expensive to deploy. Now consider legal defense. High-profile cases do not just cost money. They burn cash at a relentless pace. Lawyers expect to be paid on time, staff expect salaries, vendors expect certainty. If cash flow becomes unpredictable, the entire operation becomes brittle. That is not a moral judgment, it is arithmetic. And arithmetic is one of the few things capitalism treats as sacred. You might hear speculation about constitutional mechanisms or political outcomes layered on top of this. But I want to separate fact from conjecture. Financial institutions do not act based on what might happen politically years from now. They act based on near-term enforceable risk. What is collectible? What is lienable? What could be frozen by court order? That is the lens. Everything else is noise. What we are really watching is the moment when a figure long treated as systemically indulgible starts being treated as systemically inconvenient. And that transition is brutal. The same system that once bent rules to accommodate growth now rigidly enforces them to prevent loss. There is no loyalty in this process, only incentives. And this is where the story widens beyond one individual, because the lesson here is not that power always falls. It is that power is conditional. It is rented from institutions that can revoke access the moment the math stops working in their favor. If that feels unsettling, it should, because most people live their entire economic lives under those conditions, just without the illusion that status will save them when the numbers turn cold. At this point, it is worth asking who actually makes these decisions, because it is rarely the faces you see on television. It is compliance officers, risk managers, and legal teams whose job is to imagine how bad things could get and then act before they do. These are not ideological actors. They are trained to assume the worst and prepare for it. When they see a convergence of legal exposure, reputational damage, and uncertain asset valuations, their mandate is simple. Reduce exposure now and explain it later. And here is something most people do not realize. Once a client is internally reclassified as high risk, every interaction changes. Transactions that once cleared automatically get flagged. Transfers require extra sign-offs. Credit terms tighten. Sometimes nothing is officially frozen, but everything slows down just enough to change behavior. That slowdown is often enough to force hard choices. Which bills get paid first? Which projects get shelved? Which allies quietly drift away? This is how financial power erodes in practice, not with a dramatic seizure, but with friction. Friction creates delay. Delay creates cost. Cost creates weakness. And weakness invites further scrutiny. It is a feedback loop. And once it starts, it is hard to reverse because the system interprets stress as confirmation of its own caution. Now, think about the people who depend on these structures: employees, contractors, service workers, even local governments that rely on property taxes and tourism. When liquidity tightens at the top, the shock travels downward. Paychecks get delayed, contracts get renegotiated, communities feel it. This is why elite financial instability is never contained to elites alone. The structure of ownership ensures the consequences spread. There is also a media dynamic worth unpacking. Sensational claims about total collapse or instant bankruptcy attract attention, but they obscure the slower, more instructive reality. Capital does not usually flee in a single stampede. It exits through side doors, one relationship at a time. And by the time the public notices, the decisive moves have already been made. You might be asking yourself whether this represents accountability or just another example of how systems protect themselves. The honest answer is that it is both. Courts and regulators impose consequences, but financial institutions respond primarily to risk, not justice. If tomorrow the math changed and the risk evaporated, accommodation would return. That is not cynicism. That is how incentive structures work. And this is where I want to bring it back to you, because the same logic that governs billion-dollar accounts governs your mortgage, your student loans, your credit score. The system does not wait for failure. It anticipates it and disciplines you in advance. Watching it happen at the top can feel cathartic, but it should also feel familiar. What we are seeing is not a singular downfall. It is a demonstration of how conditional economic power really is, how quickly status turns into liability once institutions decide you are no longer worth bending for. And if you have ever wondered why ordinary people feel trapped while the wealthy seem untouchable, moments like this reveal the truth. They are not untouchable. They are just tolerated until they are not. Once you see it that way, the question stops being whether he will go broke and starts being what this tells us about the system we all live under, because the uncomfortable answer is that capitalism is incredibly forgiving right up until the moment it is not. And when that moment comes, It enforces discipline with breathtaking speed, not out of morality, not out of fairness, but out of self-preservation. The system does not punish hubris, it punishes instability. This is where class really matters. For most people, instability shows up early. A missed paycheck, a medical bill, a rent increase. The margin for error is thin, so consequences arrive fast. For people at the top, instability can be masked for years by access, relationships, and the benefit of the doubt. But the underlying rule is the same. Once risk outweighs usefulness, protection evaporates. The delay is not mercy, it is leverage. There is a tendency to frame this moment as poetic justice or final reckoning, but that framing lets the system off the hook. Because the same financial architecture that now appears to be constraining Trump is the architecture that enabled decades of aggressive leverage, permissive lending, and asset inflation in the first place. Banks profited handsomely from those relationships when they were lucrative. They only discovered caution when the downside appeared. That pattern should sound familiar if you lived through the financial crisis or if you watched corporations receive forgiveness while households were told to tighten their belts. Risk is socialized on the way up and individualized on the way down. That is not an accident. It is a design feature, and it is why stories like this resonate so strongly. They momentarily invert the usual direction of discipline, but inversion is not transformation. If anything, this episode highlights how little democratic control exists over financial power. Decisions that reshape political narratives and economic realities are made behind closed doors by institutions accountable primarily to shareholders and regulators, not to the public. Whether you view the outcome as justified or excessive, it is not something voters ever get to decide. I also want to be careful not to flatten the human dimension. There are workers tied to these businesses who did nothing to create the legal or financial exposure now rippling through the organization. There are communities economically linked to properties whose fate depends on decisions made far above their heads. Capitalism has a way of turning structural consequences into personal pain for people with the least control. So when you hear talk of frozen accounts or seized assets, do not just ask whether it is true in the narrow sense. Ask what it reveals. It reveals that wealth is not independence. It is dependence on systems that can withdraw consent. It reveals that power is conditional, transactional, and always temporary. And it reveals that the rules applied to you every day do eventually apply upward too, just slower and more quietly. The real lesson here is not about one man losing access to money. It is about how access itself is the real currency and how quickly it can be rationed once institutions decide the risk is no longer worth the reward. What should stay with you is not whether a particular account was frozen on a particular day. That is trivia. What should stay with you is how invisible power actually operates. Financial authority does not usually announce itself. It whispers through delays, reviews, reclassifications, and silent denials. By the time the public notices, the outcome is often already locked in. That is true at the level of billionaires, and it is even more true in your own life, where you do not have lawyers, accountants, or media attention acting as shock absorbers. Ask yourself, who decides when risk becomes unacceptable? It is not voters. It is not juries. It is institutions whose primary obligation is to preserve themselves. They do not ask whether someone deserves access. They ask whether extending access exposes them to loss. That distinction matters because it explains why the system can tolerate harm for years and then suddenly clamp down once the balance sheet feels threatened. Accountability arrives not when damage is done, but when confidence collapses. And notice how quietly this power is exercised. No elections, no hearings, no democratic oversight, just internal memos and compliance reviews that reshape real lives. In a society where money is the gateway to legal defense, political organization, media reach, and personal mobility, restricting access is not just a financial act, it is a political one, even if it is never labeled that way. This is also why the myth of absolute wealth is so dangerous. We are taught to believe that once you reach a certain level, you are insulated from consequence. But insulation is conditional. It depends on continued usefulness to the system. The moment someone becomes more risky than profitable, the insulation thins. What looks like immunity is often just deferred vulnerability. For most people, that vulnerability is constant and visible. A job loss means missed rent. A medical emergency means debt. A credit downgrade means higher costs everywhere. Watching this logic finally apply upward can feel satisfying, but satisfaction should not distract you from recognition. This is the same machinery that governs your life. It just usually works faster on you and slower on those with influence. So when you hear talk of collapse or final nails or dramatic endings, I would urge you to resist that framing. Systems like this do not end cleanly. They grind, they constrain, they renegotiate power behind closed doors. And whether this particular figure adapts, survives, or fades is not the central issue. The central issue is that none of this required a vote, a revolution, or even public consensus. It required institutions deciding that the risk profile had changed. That should sharpen your understanding of how class really works, not as a moral category, but as a relationship to risk and access. Those at the top do not escape the rules. They experience them differently later and with more cushioning. That difference is not an accident. It is the core feature of the system. If there is a takeaway I want you to sit with, it is this. Power in capitalism is not about what you own. It is about what you are allowed to use and for how long. Access is the real currency, and access can be withdrawn without drama, without permission, and without apology. If you care about democracy, about fairness, about your own security, this is why understanding economic power matters. Not to cheer collapses, not to idolize survivors, but to see clearly how decisions are made when nobody is asking you what you think. If this kind of clarity matters to you, stay engaged, question the headlines, interrogate the incentives, share your perspective, subscribe if you want to keep pulling these systems apart with me. Because in a world where confusion protects power, understanding is not just educational, it is quietly radical. In today's digital world, cryptocurrency is no longer just a trend. For many people, it has become a real business opportunity that can be started with basic knowledge and an internet connection. The first step in treating crypto as a business is education. Understanding simple concepts like Bitcoin, Ethereum, wallets, exchanges, and how the market works is essential before putting in any money. Some people use trading to earn short-term profits, while others focus on long-term holding. And there are also options like staking and passive income where crypto can grow over time without constant buying and selling. What makes crypto attractive is flexibility. You can work from anywhere, control your own schedule, and start with a small amount if you are careful. However, crypto is not gambling. Successful people treat it seriously. They do proper research, manage risk wisely, and never invest money they cannot afford to lose. The market goes up and down, so patience and discipline matter more than chasing quick profits. When crypto is handled with planning and consistency, it can become a long-term income path instead of a risky shortcut. If you want more simple and practical videos about crypto and online income, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay connected for upcoming content.